And I think the aim for today, at least my aim for today, is to firstly see you really how Toronto has dealt with the shock of the pandemic and how you feel it could recover. And I guess what the learnings have been as a city and how you're capturing those. And then we can share the same about London. And I'm not suggesting that London and Toronto are the same. They have absolutely their unique cultures, I'm sure, around work, around home, but they absolutely are both global cities. And I'm sure there's lots we have in common. So really on that note, Michelle, I think we should probably get on to the content of today.
Sure, absolutely. So we're mindful of the clock. Before we get started, Farah, did you want to say a word or two before we pass the microphone to Anna?
Sure. I just wanted to thank, both Siobhan and Michelle for, inviting us to be a part of this event. This type of networking and collaboration is really what Crew is all about. So we're so excited to learn from each other today and learn more about London's real estate market. I can share the sentiment of Siobhan that, one amazing thing to come from the challenges today is that we're learning now that while we are apart in many ways, we're actually even closer than ever before, and we can come together in sort of these new ways and support each other. So it's so great to be with you guys today. To that end, I think we invited everyone here to learn and share perspectives on the commercial real estate markets in London and Toronto. And specifically, our presenters will be sharing insights by asset class, sort of pre and post-COVID. So we're going to kick it off now with Toronto to start, and I think each presenter, Anna and Helena, will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for a discussion forum. So sort of keep your questions ready. And, so leading the discussion for Toronto, we have Anna Kennedy. Anna is the COO of KingSett Capital and also served as the president for Toronto Crew in 2018. And Anna is such an accomplished leader in our industry, serving, having served as the EVP and CFO of Oxford Properties and now on the executive team at KingSett for the past 10 years. And personally, Anna has inspired me in the way in which she leads by example. And I've been so fortunate to learn from her through several years as leaders for Crew. And she's personally championed me and many others and provided platforms for us to lead in our industry. So we're in very good hands today, and I'm going to pass it off to Anna to share a little bit more about KingSett and then provide the market update for Toronto. So Anna, off to you.
Well, thank you, Farah, for that very nice introduction. Thank you. And hopefully I have something of interest to share with you today about Toronto. So KingSett, I'll start with KingSett a little bit. KingSett Capital is one of Canada's leading real estate private equity firms. We've got about 13 billion under management. We invest across 5 fund strategies. So we've got opportunity funds, we've got a large income fund, several mortgage funds, and a couple of what we call urban infill funds, and then of course some single asset vehicles as well. We've raised $11 billion of equity for investment in our funds over an 18-year history, and we've completed over 40 billion of real estate transactions. We invest across a variety of asset classes, largely in key Canadian urban markets, and most currently in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, what we call our MTV strategy, because that is where immigration, employment, GDP growth have all been the strongest in recent years. We are very heavily weighted to Toronto, where we have about 70% of our business under management, and I'm going to focus many of my remarks today on our business in the Toronto market. So Toronto had a very positive economic outlook in early 2020, and that was fueled by job growth from technology and financial sectors. We had positive leasing momentum, and in fact, at March 31, 2020, the market vacancy rates in Toronto were at historic lows. Toronto Class A office had only 2% vacancy, industrial 1.6%, and multi-residential vacancies were at 1.5%. So I would say that that's a fully occupied market by most people's standards. Our portfolio of committed occupancy in Toronto office at the end of March was 97%. Our Toronto industrial was 91%, and we're at 96% occupied in our 3,400 unit residential portfolio. You know, in our regional shopping centers, which is by far the toughest of the asset classes, occupancy was pretty good. It was 91%, and we had trailing 12-month mall sales was up a solid 3.7% in mid-March. Of course, everything was proceeding quite nicely to that point, and then in mid-March, COVID-19 struck, and the resulting shutdown understandably had a large impact on our fund's smaller commercial tenants and retail tenants, especially those in retail malls and on our urban infill portfolios, where many of them simply cannot operate their businesses because they can't physically access their space. Of course, the biggest challenge revolves around the collection of rents. April was not too bad. Across all of our commercial leases, we collected 77% of our rents portfolio-wide. And the majority of the remainder that was not collected were subject to rental deferral agreements that we had established with those tenants. And we also found that size matters. So for leases that were under 5,000 square feet, about 30% of the rent was collected in April. For leases between 5 and 25,000 square feet, 69% was paid. But for our leases of over 25,000 square feet, 92% of the rent was paid in April. In our apartment portfolio, we collected 95%, which is really pretty standard in the marketplace because apartment was certainly the most resilient asset class. We also have mortgage funds, as I spoke to earlier, and in our $1.9 billion portfolio of mortgages, interest was paid on everything but 4 loans, totaling about $17 million. And in those 4 cases, we worked with those borrowers that required some deferrals of 3 months, and we were happy to do so given the quality of the loans and the collateral. So we were, I must say, this is one area that did surprise us a little. We always felt that our loan portfolio was very strong, but we were surprised at how robust it was and how much of the interest was paid with no discussion. May rent collections have been a bit lower, as expected, but remarkably close to April. So again, we've been quite pleased with how the May rents have gone. However, the longer it takes to open up this economy, the harder this is going to become. So time really is of the essence. We're also responding to many rent deferral requests from our tenants on a case-by-case basis, as I spoke to earlier. But most recently, we're working with tenants to assist in the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. I had to get that out, which has just recently been released for qualifying tenants. So this is a government program for tenants that are paying less than $50,000 per month in rent and that have consolidated sales. So this is corporate consolidated sales of less than $20 million per annum. So it is meant for smaller tenants. And it's meant for tenants that have suffered a loss of revenue greater than 70%. And so by making this application, what the landlord is doing is asking for federal government assistance for forgivable loans of up to 50% of those qualifying tenants' gross rents. And then the tenant pays the additional 25%. So in return, essentially, the landlord is giving the tenant a break of 75% and gets 50% from the government, and then in essence eats 25%. And you know, that's really a pretty good deal for some of these smaller tenancies, because in spite of the fact that we might have negotiated rent deferrals, you know, there would have been some pretty hefty bad debt provisions that would have to be made for some of those deferrals, because it's unlikely that smaller tenants would be able to pay their future rents in addition to trying to make up the rent that was foregone for those periods where they weren't earning revenues. On the investment front, our funds have certainly been transacting at a much slower pace than normal, but we do continue to be active. Our mortgage funds have continued to write solid credit loans and with better pricing and better security because we've sharpened our pencils clearly in an environment like this. And in our urban infill funds, we have 3 properties under contract for sale currently that are going to transact at prices that are higher than our 2019 year-end appraised values, which I thought was pretty encouraging. We've also signed a conditional agreement to sell our sole grocery-anchored retail center, which is located just outside East GTA. And though the COVID crisis has delayed the whole due diligence process and board approvals, we do expect to transact in early Q3. In our opportunity funds, these are, largely invested by large institutional investors. In Q1, we did 523 million of sales across 8 different properties, and we're poised to complete a capital markets transaction of 2.5 billion later this year in the multi-residential space. So, we've kind of shown that notwithstanding that the market uncertainty and there's practical challenges of transacting, buyers and sellers can act if compelling opportunities surface. And we do expect that, today's market uncertainty will yield some additional investment opportunities for the funds. We will just have to be patient and wait and look for opportunities to high grade our portfolios to create value and mitigate risk. I thought I might just take a few minutes to talk about, share with you some points that we shared with our investors about different trends that we see and predict for the various asset classes. So for office, we think that we should be anticipating de-densification. So looking for tenants to plan more square feet per person, at least in the short term. Then, of course, there's the concept of working from home. And so much speculation that office is dead because we're all going to work from home. We simply don't believe that because we do feel that, we are social beings and that we have always come together to conduct work because that's the way we build culture and values and creativity and engagement. And we do believe that that will happen. However, there's definitely going to be much more flexibility in the way that we do that. And we think that the working from home together with the de-densification is going to essentially work together to not necessarily have that big an impact on the demand for office space. And, in a market like Toronto, where there was only 2% vacancy at the end of March, there really isn't enough opportunity for de-densification. So we do need some working from home just to be able to allow people to be better spaced in their workplace. And we do expect that tech and finance, once we're all able to get back to work, are going to continue to be drivers of growth in this market. In retail, we do believe that we will shop again and in person. But it's going to take a long time, and I think that this is really the trickiest asset class. We think that what we call integrated office and high street retail will recover faster than malls. So integrated office would be, the food courts and the bank spaces, et cetera, at the base of office towers. And as office towers come back, so will that. And high street retail, of course, will come back because it's all storefronts on major thoroughfares like Yonge Street and Bay Street and Bloor Street. Adaptive reuse, we think that weaker retail malls will transition to other uses, such as entertainment, industrial, office, maybe even co-working space. Of course, we're going to see the continued evolution of the bricks and clicks and embracing the pick, pack, and pick up models. But we also think that, this whole mantra of good quality retail being an experience, a connection, and a community will come back, especially when you think about the fact that there will be so few forms of entertainment. We're not going to sporting events right away. We're not going to theater. We're not going to concerts. people will be looking for ways to get out in a way that that can be safe. And perhaps there's a place for a community mall to provide that form of entertainment. So we think the net impact is that the lockdown is going to translate into a very tough year for retail nationally. But we do think that with time, that the very best malls and retail space will come back. And those that are not as strong perhaps will not fare as well. But this is a trend that began long before COVID and is just continuing. Multi-residential trends, there will be some more vacancy for sure because, students, for instance, if universities aren't opening in person, there'll be less demand for student space downtown. There are people that aren't working, they may be doubling up, maybe going back to family homes. But in the long term, the residential is the most resilient asset class, and there is so little supply of residential in this city and so much demand for it, especially as immigration picks up again, because immigration was a big driver of the demand for residential in Toronto. And the other thing is that size may matter more. We may see some demand for apartment buildings that are a little bit further outside of the core as compared to the sort of micro condo rental market that has been so strong. We do think that will continue to be strong, but we think that there may be some additional demand for something that's a little larger, more purpose-built. Then there's long-term care and student housing, where for sure we're going to see de-densification. There'll be incremental demand for this space because we need to ensure that we're providing individual space for these users. And that may, in Toronto alone, may exceed several thousand beds. Industrial trends. Industrial was so strong going into this crisis, and we think that it will become stronger. Inshoring, the increase for domestic production, distribution, and shortage of items that are deemed essential will accelerate the demand for industrial space. Just in case replaces just in time. Those items that we found ourselves coming up short because we couldn't get them from the regular sources that we relied on. And of course, e-commerce will continue to consume more industrial space as distribution and last mile needs accelerate. So we see lots of demand for industrial space. So most recently, our focus has been shifted to reopening buildings and getting back to business in conjunction with industry association guidelines and property management teams. We're preparing each asset to reopen and creating unique plans using industry best practices for each of our assets. We have a slogan. We always have slogans. It's our work safe, shop safe, live safe plans, where we're preparing buildings, training workforce, better access controls, physical distancing plans, reduction of touch points, enhanced cleaning, all building on things that have been put in place during this COVID shutdown. So our properties are going to be ready to welcome back customers when they're ready to come back. Our office tenants, some of our largest office tenants, have told us that they're starting to bring tenants back into the office as early as the first few weeks of June. Some will be building to 40 or 50% over the summer. And we think that those are positive first steps to our next normal. That's it for today.
Thanks, Anna. I love your positive first steps. As Helena and I were chatting over the last couple of days, we were talking about positive sort of indications around the world. And I was recapping, Japan came off a state of emergency. Spain is opening for vacationers and holiday folks 1st of July. And I think the New York Stock Exchange opened for business yesterday. So I hope that complements what you're bringing the employees back into the office space. 50% or so in the middle of midsummer that's great. I had three. We're going to save a significant amount of time at the end of Helena's presentation for Q&A, but just three real quick notations. The scenario about the landlord, tenant, and government exchange of capital is, I found that to be super, super important. We have a few other Crew UK board members on the phone, and we've been talking about weathering the storm and how the government is stepping in. Many governments are stepping in. So I thought that was very important. And the fact that your work from home is necessary, that to me is another positive indicator of how quickly Toronto is going to, as we say, another indicator of weathering the storm. And then adaptive reuse is such a enterprising concept in many urban markets, right? So it'll be interesting to see what cities do what with whatever space they have. I witnessed it a number of years ago in New York after the 2008 crash, when healthcare tried to take a stakehold in commercial office buildings in Midtown New York. So it'll be interesting. So interesting to see how that sort of idea unfolds in different marketplaces. So thank you for that. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce Helena. So I came on board to Crew UK as a program person in, late November, and I feel very lucky. I was on the Crew New York board, and stepping back into the workforce late last year, I adopted like the best board members I could ever have. We can't tell New York that, but Helena and Catherine's on the phone, Siobhan, Ginny, Rebecca, I'm so grateful to have you as mentors and board members. So Helena, you have been an inspiration for the Crew UK board. You're a director at the Instant Group. Your energy and passion for this industry is at the top of many professionals that I've met. So I'm pleased to have met you and to work for in spirit of Crew UK, as you're so involved supporting the organization. And with that, I'll pass the microphone and let you talk about London.
Okay, thank you. I think firstly, just to say, Anna, some of the similarities with Toronto are striking, and I'm sure as I chat through London, you'll all notice those. But let's face it, COVID-19 is not a crisis for which any of us were prepared. Its impact and the consequences of the efforts that have had to be made to mitigate its spread are putting our global collaboration to the test, and I think today is a really great forum to have that discussion with. So a little bit on London. So dare I mention the B word, as it's sometimes referred to, Brexit. Early in 2020, our UK real estate sector was enjoying a cautious recovery, and transactional activity had dipped previously in the run-up to our general election in December 2019, mainly driven by uncertainty over the B word, Brexit, which is now a word that seems to be long forgotten amongst COVID-19. Momentum had started to return, however, and investor interest had remained strong. But clearly, as is the case with the rest of the world, as COVID-19 began to spread, large portions of our economy have been paralysed and things have significantly shifted. Real estate is clearly particularly at risk, feels pain and impact from every sector who use occupiable space, and the damage is substantial and increasingly evident that demand use requirements for a property are going to change for good. But more on that later, and I think the differences across our two countries will be quite interesting. Few people would have thought that in London we would have expected a record high for the first quarter in terms of investment statistics, but we did. The average transaction value for property in the UK was £46 million. But more telling, however, was that the number of deals was actually at an 8-year low. So taken together and taking COVID-19 into account, it's clear that investors have shied away from those smaller deals, but stayed committed to those bigger opportunities. Obviously, the first quarter ran through until the end of March, and the impact, as Anna said, was really from early to mid-March onwards. So why did the big deals survive? Big deals are key to an investor's long-term strategy. They're not going to change. They're a move into healthcare or logistics, and those investors are still going to strive for those goals. I'm sure many of you have seen photos of beautiful London streets, absolutely deserted on the news, but it's not all bad news. There are some pros and cons to that, and I wanted to look at each sector briefly, and I'm going to take them in reverse, if you like, to be more comfortable at the end with my area, which is more the commercial and the office space. So firstly, residential or multifamily. Clearly, as Anna said, I think throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, living sectors have maintained their reputation for resilience with stable operating cash flows, but the future performance of the different living sectors will vary significantly. Anyone keeping a keen eye on the prime central London property market, which is always quite interesting, over the last 5 years would see significant spikes and troughs in demand. Nothing could have prepared investors for the impact of COVID-19, and not even Brexit had such an impact, of course. But market uncertainty around Brexit was beginning to dissipate, and projections and forecasts are now having to unfortunately be readjusted to account for the inevitable decline in transactions throughout the first half of the year, simply because of lockdown measures and many people not even being able to look at space or even move ahead. So what about the long term for prime central London real estate in terms of this sector? More hopeful, I think, than many would assume. The contributing factors that positioned 2020 as a year for recovery haven't disappeared because of COVID-19. Brexit, we've moved on from that now. The sort of uptick in investor confidence remains, and we had seen some good year-on-year growth starting to come through. Nationwide and Halifax, two of our largest mortgage companies, had recorded a 3% annual increase in UK property prices since March 2019. So there is some growth in that, which is a good sign. One of the organisations that has had to revise their property price forecasts in light of COVID-19 is Knight Frank. And they believe that the market inactivity as a result of the pandemic will lead to this short-term decrease in property values of 3%, which is a bit more optimistic than Savills, who placed the decline at anywhere between 5 and 10%. However, Knight Frank believe that by 2021, the revival of activity will have fueled a predicted 8% increase in prime central London prices. So bearing in mind they were quoting a 3% decrease and an 8% increase by 2021, I think things are looking a little bit more positive. Multifamily is considered, to be one of the most resilient sectors, but time will tell whether unemployment begins to soften, the rental demand. So moving on to retail. Clearly, recent weeks, the retailers have faced one of their most significant challenges here in the UK, working tirelessly to feed the nation, look after staff, and for many companies try to remain solvent, not necessarily the ones that are feeding the nation, of course. Consumer sentiment, as would have been expected, fell sharply in March, recovered slightly in April, thanks to the UK government announcing some support measures. And our non-essential shops have been told that they can open from mid-June. So many shops are expecting to see some improvements there, of course, although we will have a few missing from our high streets, and restaurants, bars and pubs, we'll have to wait to hear more about when they can open. In the short term, the focus for retailers has clearly been to preserve cash. The rising number of retail and leisure operators to assess opportunities and options to offset the loss of their revenue from their physical store portfolios has increased. Many gyms, for example, have been offering online workouts via some sort of subscription service, or even occasionally free of charge to tempt people in. The difference in this sector is striking. Clearly, food sales growth has been enormous, whilst non-food sales growth, we're expecting that to decline. Customers can clearly reduce their spending, although I'm sure some of the online shopping that has arrived at my door would negate that slightly. But I do think, we have started to see, or continue to see, a trend towards supporting small and local businesses, and that seems to have gained weight. Certainly, as there's been a much more of a sense of community in many places across the country, and I'm sure in central London. But how much floor space are retailers really going to need if current levels of online shopping continue? They've been in survival mode, but retailers need to adapt. In the future, they've got to be better prepared, more resilient for a seismic shift like this. And the retailers that have been successful have seen a diversification of customer, of route to market, of their range, and flexibility to react, to adapt, and to reinvent. And those retailers that have managed to achieve that have been more successful. But the businesses need to right size to improve their chances of long-term success. And we may see that as this structural change in the retail market accelerates, there'll be greater emphasis on a shift towards more of a flexible multi-channel model, potentially with strengthened partnerships between landlords and retailers, more collaboration perhaps, examples of shops opening within hospitals, for example, and clearly having the right infrastructure in place for online fulfillment, which is highly important. Hospitality, a rather sad sector at the moment. London, I'm sure many of you have either visited or know from experience that London is a really popular travel location for business and pleasure. And clearly the COVID-19 impact is being felt very deeply. Our hotels remain closed and are not expected to open till July at the earliest. And it's evident that we've really felt these stricter lockdown policies have had a significant impact than in some parts of the world. I listened into a really interesting seminar recently delivered by a company called STR, and they quoted that over the following 3 months, so from the 18th of May for 3 months, an occupancy of less than 7% is predicted across all London hotels. Quite simply, that 7% are long-term residents that have remained in situ. There's nobody else in these hotels. And we're all aware that international travel is ground to a halt. It's expected to be slow to recover. Our UK government has announced fairly restrictive quarantines for travellers coming into the UK. So it'll be interesting to see the impact of that. Hundreds of thousands of hotels entering debt restructuring, administration, but they're not going to go away completely. It makes sense for hotels to continue to exist. We need them, and certainly in London. And the lenders will be reviewing their past performance to help predict their recovery timelines. But a broader question perhaps does exist with hotels. Is there a desire from the public to get back to normal? And could the pandemic really trigger structural change to this industry? I'm sure, organisations, companies like Airbnb would probably be pleased to hear that. Last but not quite last but least, but penultimate one, industrial and logistics. In terms of that, like Toronto, I think you mentioned that this was a really strong sector. Cushman & Wakefield released their quarterly one review, and take up of industrial space was 32% below average in the first quarter, despite many occupiers needing to fulfill more online orders and store more goods. However, short-term inquiries have really picked up, lots of new requirements for logistics space, and it's really expected that the pandemic will actually accelerate trends that were already evident across the sector. Expansion of online grocery has been a massive thing in the UK. Omni-channel retailing, integration of technology into warehouse, all of those things that were already happening are continuing to progress. The fundamentals were quite strong prior to COVID-19. Occupier demand's been, exceptionally robust. And vacancy, most importantly, at near record lows. So we really do expect, the pandemic for this sector to be well placed to recover from the pandemic and the COVID-19 situation, and probably expect to see more regional demand as well. So for manufacturing facilities, logistics sites, as companies are starting to look and focus on their domestic supply chain. Obviously, nobody has any warehousing in central London. That would be ridiculous. Last but not least, commercial office space. At the beginning of May, Cushman's again released their review of the first quarter for 2020. Quite simply, states that occupiers are looking for new space were highly active in the first months of the year, but by March it become difficult for those deals to progress. COVID-19 situation had kicked in. Interestingly, leasing volumes were 20% below average for office space in London at the end of the first quarter, but the amount of space under offer was 28% above average. So quite an interesting statistic there. Clearly COVID-19 has had a swift impact. Not being able to collect rent, quite interesting, clearly led to cash flow implications for real estate companies struggling to meet their operating costs. I read recently in one of the pieces of information that 60% of the rent collected on average, so perhaps in comparison to your 70%, Anna. But the main concern, I think, for many is that new inquiries for office space have become increasingly rare. In the short term, the flexible workspace sector, which is particularly close to my heart, has seen a downturn in requirements, although perhaps not as harshly as expected from outside our industry. This has been a really high growth market for London, and in recent years has accounted for a real significant share of leasehold take-up. In Q3 2019, for example, it was 28% of the take-up was flex office operators, and over 5 years a quarterly average of 16%, according to a recent JLL report. So a significant market sector. Outside of that, overall leasing activity in Q1 had slowed. It was the slowest start to the year since 2011, but it can't really be contributed just to COVID-19. The impact for that was really only felt in March. There were fewer larger transactions in the quarter. The majority of them fell below 25,000 square feet, which they're not significant. And the decline in take-up of the flex workspace sector had been felt there. Could in part be due to the saturation in the flex market in London, for example. London is one of the world's most mature markets for flex workspace. Overall, the good news is that potentially good news is that commercial supply in London is low. Speculative developments are at a historic low, and of course in addition to that, any delay in office development completions is going to add to that pressure on supply. COVID-19 has disrupted the London investment market, although to be seen so far, not too significantly, of course, but of course we're only seeing statistics for Q1. Global headwinds saw international investors from Asia behave far more cautiously. However, having said that, according to a recent JLL report, 5 of the 7 largest transactions in Q1 were with international investors. So at the moment, a slowing rather than a stalling. And we'll have to wait, and it remains to be seen to see if there's any material impact on pricing terms. So what do we know? I think despite the shift to mass home working and this generally deemed successful experiment, the physical office is going to maintain an importance particularly for facilitating interaction and collaboration. But what does it look like? I don't think anyone knows quite yet. We've held some discussions with quite a few key corporates in a CRE consortium at the Instant Group, and several of our clients have raised the probability of reducing their footprint requirements in head office locations, increasing their home working, and giving their teams more flexibility, more choice of workplace. Maybe not quite as drastic as Twitter, who have come out and said that a lot of people will be working from home in their organisation from now on, but we certainly expect to see a shift. And over the longer term, perhaps may accelerate a shift towards a greater reliance on regional hubs, so a move away from central London locations. I, for one, I don't live in central London. My commute is over an hour and a half each way. It's very nice for me to spend that time at home and not sitting on a cramped train. So I would be very happy to work in a regional location, certainly for some of the week, if not a bit more of the week. But in the worst case scenario, clearly real estate companies in central London would be left with pretty expensive and rather significantly devalued assets for which there's no demand. But at the same time, there could be a surge in regional hubs, and perhaps where that real estate doesn't exist in places at the moment, so would need to be developed. But it's impossible to predict. I'm sure if we all had a crystal ball, then we would be rich. I think what we can probably all agree on, to varying degrees, is that this crisis is going to permanently change the use of commercial real estate. I've been recently involved in a CoreNet hackathon around space metrics and utilisation, and we discussed metrics in the future looking very different to those used in the past. For example, health and well-being is likely to become a much greater driver of value across all forms of real estate, something that perhaps previously was somewhat overridden by a number of other metrics. And we do know things are going to have to change and not necessarily return to normal. And indeed, do people want it to return to normal? The trajectory of the office market is going to be shaped by this pandemic, our government's response to managing the crisis and the impact of it, and the change in demand from the user as to how space should be used, what it looks like and where it should be. What's the point in me coming into an office in central London, which takes me an hour and a half to get there, if I'm going to sit in a box and not be able to talk to or interact with any of my colleagues? I would be happier to stay at home. So we're really expecting clients to future-proof their portfolios, something that the cleverer clients have done already, perhaps accelerating that now. Probably adapting to more home working, providing that variety of choice of workplace, reducing their real estate footprint, and providing more collaborative space within the office. Perhaps not in the short term. I do understand that people are not necessarily going to want to be, super close to each other, but we know that people come to an office to interact with others, not to be on their own. So, it's not just a place to come to work, it's a place to collaborate. So we think that issues such as densification, employee well-being, flexibility and sustainability, and a greener environment are also going to feature really heavily in the future. So interested to hear your thoughts, and I will wrap up there.
Thank you, Helena. Hotel bars are a must. I mean, I commented on the chat. I want to say a very special thank you to you and to Anna. Tara and I had this conversation a couple weeks ago about creating efficiency. Everyone's working from home, but everyone's also very busy, right? We're networking, we're generating business, we're keeping things afloat. And when we can bring 30 plus people together and in 45 minutes give economic overviews for two powerhouse markets, Toronto and London, I'm just in awe. So thank you so much for Anna, for your insight and your data. Helena, you as well, insight and data. We covered 5 to 6 asset classes, like I said, in about 30 minutes. So well done, and thank you so much. The thing I wanted to say is that I'm just keeping my eye on the clock. We have about 10 minutes. I also want to say thank you to everyone for chatting within the Zoom group. I'm seeing all sorts of intel exchanges. So how about we do this? How about we start with Alison McIntosh? You asked a very good question. And if this is okay, it would be great to hear from Anna and Helena as the questions pop up. And if we get a few solid questions out there, fabulous. And then we'll be sure to wrap up right before 5 o'clock. So with that, Alison, if it's okay, I'm going to read your question. Where's Alison? She's here. There she is. Hi, Alison. This is a smart one because everyone's talking about this. And my husband and I had a conversation this morning. The company he works for is thinking about going back to the office, and I said, "Well, how many hours is it going to take for you to get there if everyone's social distancing on the tube, right? So out to Canary Wharf." So it's quite interesting. But the question is, one of the biggest barriers: return to work, downtown core, very reasonable aversion to public transit. How will workers get to work. So Helena, would you like to take that one and comment?
It's a good question, because as you can imagine, my train journey, I think I mentioned, my train journey is an hour and 10 minutes. That's not a bicycle ride. So I certainly won't be getting on a bike to do that. Although, our UK government is encouraging people to walk and to cycle, and are investing in cycle routes indeed across London. So I think where people can, they will get there by their own steam, but unfortunately that's not feasible for all. And I think that's probably, for me, that's one of the biggest barriers to returning to work in London. You can set the office up brilliantly, and we can have as much social distancing, but just the fact that I've got to get there on a train that realistically I'm not even going to get on is going to be a big thing. So I think hence that mix of working environments is going to be of interest to people moving forward. The possibility of more home working, hopefully when the children go back to school, so that we don't have so many distractions, but also that near home working, so the ability to collaborate with other team members who live more locally to you, but perhaps is only a 10-minute drive in a car, and there's parking and it's more regional. Central London, you really do need to use public transport to get in or to navigate across, and for many of us that's very restrictive. I guess it's similar in the downtown areas in Toronto, though.
I think that we've had, a large shift to people wanting to live downtown. We have a lot of people that do live within walking distance of the downtown core, and I expect that there will be a lot of people that will walk or will ride bicycles, etc. I also think that we're going to see a resurgence of people driving to work, and it's not quite as difficult in Toronto as it might be in London to get into the city. And I do think that we will see people, maybe I don't know whether they'll double up and do carpooling, but I do think that we will see some people resume the drive to work and pay the parking just to feel safer. And, perhaps if there's a staged approach to how we reboot the economy, our public transit will be less crowded than it typically is. And I expect that people will be relying very, very heavily on, wearing face masks and perhaps gloves and hand washing and sanitation, etc. So I think, there will be a new normal about how we get around, it is my biggest concern is how people will get downtown.
So Anna, in terms I haven't been to Toronto in a number of years. It was one of my favorite cities that I went to visit. There's the residential towers. There's been a densification, right? And I think you mentioned that.
Huge, yeah.
Yeah. So New York did this a couple of years ago. So just real quick question. So there's bike lanes all over New York, and it infuriated so many drivers in New York. And various mayors have changed traffic patterns to decrease traffic. So it's interesting, that balance of the urban densification, driving a car, not driving a car. Now you have social distancing. It's such an incredible dynamic. And I don't think the answer is tomorrow or the next month or even next year. This is going to be something that unfolds over time as people get used to it.
Going to evolve for sure. I mean, we've had additional bike lanes that have been opened recently in Toronto, and so to accommodate people being able to get around, on bikes.
I read a YouGov poll, which I thought was really interesting. So YouGov is one of the government driven organisations, and they did a poll, and it said that 9% of Britons want life to return to how it was. 9%. That's striking, isn't it? I mean, and it was a very interesting article about, how much more about the pros than the cons, and how 39% of people are in fact catching up with friends and family more often in lockdown, how 40% say they've witnessed a stronger sense of local community. I think there have been some really significant shifts for a lot of people. I for one, we live in a fairly small market town. We've lived in our house for nearly 3 years, and in the last 3 months we've got to know our neighbours far better, and become friends with them as a result. And I don't want to lose that. I think a lot of people are in a similar position.
We have Lisa as a planner on the line, raising a comment about resiliency and climate change and how we design spaces in cities. I read a recent study by one of the larger architectural organizations, I believe it was Gensler, where they had done a survey of about 2,300 employees over various generations, and I believe it was almost 75% felt that working from home would be more working from home, not consistently, but more working from home would be a positive experience for them, and that social distancing would be as well. So, Helena, to compliment you, the amount of research and data and intel that's coming out about how we live and work is astonishing.
It's amazing, isn't it? There's so much out there. It's just, yeah. I mean, and a lot of it is fascinating. But I mean, and a lot of it, I read that Gensler. Thank you for sharing it, Michelle. And there were some things in it where I thought, oh, that's interesting that they've interpreted it in that way. I don't think I would have interpreted it in that way. So I think it kind of comes from different angles. I think for me, one of the striking things in that Gensler survey was that, 3 in 4 people, the reason that they go to the office is to interact with people, and that they miss people and miss the interaction. And I think that was the sort of the top of the survey for me.
Well, this is what you, Farah, and Anna and I spoke about as we were planning for this program, and is that it's flexibility and collaboration and interaction. It's just
absolutely. What we've found is that we've been able to work remotely very effectively because technology tools have evolved so much that it's feasible, and everybody's so adaptable in this period. But it's much harder to be creative. It's harder to keep everyone engaged, to ensure that everyone is feeling that connection to values and culture, etc. And you're doing it with people that you already know. Think 4, 5, 6 months down the road, as you engage new people, you hire new people, you try to bring on a different division of your business. How are you going to do it then? I love this. I love being home. I sleep longer. I eat better. I'm not getting enough exercise, sadly. But there are advantages to being at home. But if you're trying to build a business, if you're trying to be creative, it's really tough. I think we're social beings, and I think there's absolutely a place for working from home, or even for regional offices, as you spoke of, Helena. But people are going to want to get back together when they feel that it's safe to do so. And look, this isn't going to be forever. We're going to feel safe again one day. And London, downtown London, is the center of our known universe. People will always want to be in downtown central London, I think.
Yeah. And you can't do 2 meter social distancing in Piccadilly Circus.
we do have large hotel lobby bars, so that's a good thing. But we still want to be together. Okay, so we have a couple minutes, and I'd love to pass the microphone. We have time for just maybe 1 or 2 questions. If anyone who's still on the call would like to put forth a thought or a consideration. Richard.
Yeah, I would just, I'm not sure this group is representative of what's going on completely in downtown London or downtown Toronto, but I can tell you that when I speak to my nieces and nephews who are in their, late teens and early 20s, they don't look at this thing the way many of us in society are looking at this thing. They want to be back in the pubs in downtown London or the bars in downtown Toronto. They actually, this quarantine stuff for them, they haven't been impacted health-wise for the most part, and they don't get it. So if you think about the future-oriented businesses that are driving a lot of our economy, I'm 59 years old. It's not really my age group that's driving it, or my opinion that's driving it. So I would just suggest that we all consider that. I think that this time has really gotten us to communicate in a way that many of us have never communicated before. Witness this call. Number three, I think we have developed a new sensitivity for mental health. I know that we in our company are really reaching out to those of our colleagues who we may, you never know who is suffering. Thank goodness I am not suffering from mental health issues, but I've learned a lot about mental health and about being sensitive to these issues. And I think that it has made us more aware. And I think, Helena, you were talking about your community and your house and, I guess being able to see your neighbors a little more. I don't think that we have yet internalized the true cost of online retail. I just don't think the system has priced it. I don't think the system is pricing the carbon footprint. I don't think the system is pricing all that cardboard that comes into my house every day. It drives me crazy that I'm folding it and disposing of it.
Thank you.
The delivery people, the logistics. I have daughters. I know what they're returning. It's shameful. So I don't think the system has priced that in yet. And just one more thing, and it just deals with where we are on the investment side. We're just trying to figure out what the markets are going to look like so we can underwrite properly. We are looking to buy. We are actually going to go firm on something tomorrow in one of our cities across Canada, but we're really at a loss as to how deep this is. And my last thought, I don't know if anybody has lived through the early 90s. Many of us have lived through 07, 08 and think that was a very tough time. But I can tell you, the early 90s were worse than anything. And it lasted a long time. So it's yet to be seen what the impact of all of this is. We will look back, in my view, and say that this was a very, very, very significant time on the investment side. So those are just some thoughts that I bring back based on everything I've heard here today.
Thank you, Richard. And like you, I'm looking forward to sitting in a cafe in a little town somewhere and enjoying the view. Hopefully in France. I'd like to be in France. But
I was thinking Tuscany.
I'd really echo your comments about the millennials and the younger generation, because they are seeing this very differently. And so I've got a daughter in her 30s who shares a flat. They've both been having to work at home, and they don't have the space. So it's been a real challenge about how do you set yourself up when you're sharing a flat with someone and you're both trying to homework. So it's trying to remember the whole ecosystem and not get stuck in our own little bubbles that we see the world always through our own lens. I think it's a really important point you make.
I do think we have to recognize, though, that some of this is an acceleration of trends that had already started pre-COVID. The working from home trend had already started in several other, whether it be consultants for a PwC or a Deloitte or those types of workers. And it just became the largest work from home experiment that's been done now broadly. And some people who were not open to it are now saying, look, this works in some cases, not 100% of the time. So what I kind of think is that it'll be, the future will be about flexibility. It'll be about the option for that to exist and for it to be normalized. But that when you do go into the office, as Helena mentioned, it'll be about that collaboration and connection. And so as real estate providers and people who work in the industry, I think we have to start thinking about how those spaces need to be designed and managed to facilitate that collaboration and connection. And while in the short term, it may not mean we can't sit on top of each other, but in the future, I do think that's how we have to be thinking. And it means being innovative. It means that adaptive reuse of space and looking at space not in the traditional asset classes that we used to. So malls becoming distribution centers, all these kinds of things. There's so many other ways to look at it. I learned that Amazon used one of their spaces as a shelter recently. This kind of thinking of space differently, I think, is what will be really what will come out of this. And it will, like Ricky said, be very monumental, this period of time, however long it persists, on the real estate industry at large for years to come. So like you've all said, we don't have that crystal ball, but it'll be very interesting to see where some of the chips fall in the years to come. I know, Derek, you had a question earlier. I think for people who want to stay on a little bit past 12, I'm happy to stay on. Did we want to pose that? I think maybe Anna, you might be able to weigh into that question. It was, in Toronto, we are seeing some anecdotal evidence of people leaving multi-res and condo for single-family homes. Supply issues in Toronto aside, do we see that escalating or sustaining to a level that will affect multi-res valuations? Oh, Derek, you're on mute there. No.
Oh, let me see. I think that's me.
Yeah, I think also condo demand. My life is selling condos, and it's we're sort of looking in that crystal ball of demand and whether that's going to
Well, what I can tell you, I mean, it's too early to know exactly how everything will play out, but what I can tell you is that we have seen a couple of big condo projects sell very effectively during these periods in downtown Toronto, which has been really good news. Our debt guys have been following that very closely. And we're also very close to a big development restructuring or a bankruptcy, I guess, that has nothing to do with COVID. It happened pre-COVID, but is now being sold. The receivership is in the process of selling those parcels. Some of them are partially developed condo towers, some of them are holes in the ground. And the bid is very deep for those projects. And so, we are quite pleasantly surprised by the bids that we think will come in for those projects. And there seems to be lots of demand for residential development in Toronto. I think, Richard, you talked about 92 and how this might be like 92. The problem is 92 was a much more distressed business economy, right? There were problems there were liquidity problems, there was credit issues, etc. This particular crisis didn't start out as a business crisis. It's a health crisis that turned into a business crisis. And I think there's still lots of capital sitting on the sidelines waiting for opportunities to emerge. And so I think that the bid for good real estate is going to be there when it becomes available. Part of the issue is some of it's not available because there's not enough distress yet. Nobody needs to sell it. And so I think that there will be opportunities, and I think that we'll see that there is a bid for real estate. And I think, interest rates are going to stay lower for longer and be range bound because no central government, no banker can increase the rates very dramatically at this point because there's so much debt. I just think that that's a pretty good environment for real estate and real estate investment.
Yeah, let me just, I don't think I expressed myself right. What I really wanted to say about the early 90s is we went into that period with such huge oversupply that it was hugely destructive. I just meant to say it was a moment in time to remember. Absolutely. And I happen to agree. There's a tremendous amount of capital sitting on the sidelines. We're at 2% or 3% vacancy in Toronto in office space now, or just before COVID. In the early 90s, we went into it, I think, with 10% or 11%. And by the time we got out of it, it was much more than that. So I fully agree.
We have very balanced markets. We have very solid, well-capitalized investors. We have a government that's tripping over itself to provide fiscal and monetary support. Now we'll be paying it for the rest of our lives, and so will our children. But I think it will be okay. Yeah. Except for things that were already trending badly, right?
Let's leave it on a positive,
and there lies the opportunity.
Leave it as everything will be okay.
Right. Other than Taylor Swift canceling all of her concerts and going to next year, we're gonna find positivity and silver linings, right? I was just going to say it's about 10 minutes after 5. Does does anybody have any last minute? I mean, the good news is that there's more good news, and more good news is that Anna and Helena provided such intel, numbers-driven information that none of us want to leave. And the good news is we could keep talking about all of this. So we on behalf of Crew UK to Toronto Crew, thank you so much for being with us and collaborating with us and meeting, getting together virtually across the pond, and again in a very short amount of time, providing each other with great intel. So, Farah, would you like to?
Yeah, no, this was really great. I love this discussion. I welcome doing something in the future with you guys as well. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of this. It's always great to learn and just connect with other crew members, regardless of geography. That's really what crew is about. So yeah, thank you for this opportunity. So lovely to see so many of our Toronto members here today, and thanks for taking the time to join us, and nice to meet some UK members as well.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Enjoy
Bye.
the
Bye.
Bye.